What's going on, guys? Corey from Yoda Expedition here, and in this video we're going to be installing a spacer leveling kit from Maxtrac. So the whole point of a leveling kit or a spacer leveling kit, it's a super budget-friendly way to lift the front of your 4Runner. When your 4Runner comes from factory, the front end is naturally pointing towards the ground so that when you put weight in the rear or you have a trailer on, it's then sitting level. So most people that aren't putting stuff in the back of their vehicle or putting a trailer on, they just want to lift the front so that it's level all the time. So this is a super easy way to do that, and we're going to show you how to install it. So Maxtrac claims that this will lift the front of your 4Runner 2.5 inches, and you could put 32-inch tires on. We already have 265/70 mud terrains, but we're going to get a base measurement of the height from the floor to the fender with the suspension stock. We're going to put this on and we're going to see how much it actually lifted it. You can see from the side angle here, the front end naturally dips towards the ground. So we're going to get a base measurement on the front from the floor to the bottom of the fender, and then we'll see what the difference is after we put the leveling kit on. So looking at the front here, we're looking at about 34 3/4 from the floor to the bottom of the fender. So let's just measure the rear and we'll see what the difference is between the two. So on the rear, we're looking at 37 1/4. So that's a difference of 2.5 inches from the rear to the front that it is aiming towards the ground. All right, so we have the 4Runner up on the lift, we got the wheel off, and we're ready to start taking the suspension components apart to get the strut assembly out. So we're gonna have to take off this nut holding on the sway bar end link. Also, we're gonna have to take off the outer tie rod here. There is a cotter pin and a nut, 19mm nut to take off for that. We're also gonna have to take the cotter pin out of the upper control arm and take this nut off. And then I would take off the bolts holding on the ABS line and brake line, just so that when all of this is disconnected, you're not giving tension on the brake line. All right, so before you take off the outer tie rod, you want to make sure that you loosen this nut for the upper control arm. And before you separate the ball joint, you want to make sure to leave this nut on. So when it does separate, this whole assembly just doesn't come crashing down. So leave this threaded on a couple threads and pop the ball joint out, and it'll stop on the nut, and then you can finish taking the nut off. All right, so we have everything disconnected. The nuts on the top of the strut assembly are taken off. The nut on the lower piece is also taken off. The only thing we have left holding this in is the bolt going through. So we're gonna lift up on the whole assembly, pull out our bolt, and now we can pull out the whole strut and shock, and we can put the leveling kit on top. All right, so we have both strut assemblies out and on the table, and we can go ahead now and install our spacer kit. Simply just slips right onto the studs. We're going to use the factory hardware to attach the spacer onto the strut assembly. and then the provided hardware we'll use to attach the whole assembly into the vehicle. All right, so we have the spacer installed on the strut assembly. Now we're back at the 4Runner, ready to put these in. Just make sure that you have everything in the right orientation as far as the bottom and the top 3 studs. And you want to make sure to put both of the strut assemblies in first before attaching anything else, because if you go ahead and you fully assemble one side, you're not going to be able to do the other side. All right, so once you have the strut assembly bolted in, you're gonna need a jack to jack up on the lower control arm to bring this whole assembly up, so it's a little bit easier to get the upper ball joint and control arm bolted in. All right, so getting the upper control arm and ball joint into the knuckle is honestly probably the hardest part of the install. If you have a second person, I would definitely recommend grabbing them so that they could push down on this and you can get this nut started. Once you have that fully assembled, you can go ahead, lower the jack, put your outer tie rod on, your sway bar end link, and bolt back the ABS lines. So we just finished up putting this together. We took it for a quick drive just to get the suspension moving a little bit so it would be a more accurate measurement. So now we're gonna go ahead and measure from the floor to the fender again and see how much of a lift we gained. So when we measured this before, we were reading 34 3/4, and now we're at exactly 37. So we gained 2 1/4 inches. So that's pretty good. It claims 2 1/2, but at 2 1/4, I think it looks pretty level. It definitely looks way better than before. So I went ahead and measured the rear as well. Also got 37 inches from the floor to the bottom of the fender. So according to our measurements, we are now completely level from the floor to the bottom of the fender. All right, so we just finished up with the leveling kit, but we're not done yet. The Maxtrac leveling kit also comes with a diff drop spacer kit. So we're gonna go ahead and get that installed now. So pretty much what a diff drop is gonna do is drop your front differential down. Most spacers are usually around 1 inch. So anytime you put any sort of lift on the front of your 4Runner, you are making the angle of your axles a lot harsher than the factory angle. So when you drop down the differential, it brings those angles back to more of a factory spec, and you don't have to worry about your axles binding or your CV boots tearing over time. So the first thing you're gonna want to do is remove your skid plate. So this is a TRD skid plate. We have 4 14mm bolts to take off. If you have the standard skid plate, it's a little bit different, and you're gonna have a plastic shield up front to remove as well. So we're gonna go ahead and remove these now. All right, so we have both skid plates off, and now we have the front diff supported either with one of these or a jack, whatever you have. And we're gonna be unbolting these 2 bolts right here. Those are holding the front differential to the frame. And then we're gonna be putting our spacers in between this and the frame, and it comes with longer bolts that we're gonna be using. All right, now we can go ahead and lower the front diff down until we can fit our new spacers in. So you're gonna take the old cup washers off the factory bolts, transfer those over to the provided hardware. Now we can go ahead and put that up through, put the washer on, and the new nylon nut. We can go ahead and torque that down. So we have this done, the spacers are in, it's bolted back up. Now we can go ahead and reinstall the skid plates, but since we lowered this, we also have to lower this, otherwise it's gonna hit. So this particular kit comes with spacers for the skid plate as well, and longer M8 bolts, so we're gonna go ahead and install that. All right, so we got the spacers installed on the skid plate as well, so now we can go ahead and install the front skid plate and we can let it down. All right, so we went ahead and went to try installing the TRD skid plate, and the included hardware and spacers actually won't work with this. Possibly if you have some sort of other aftermarket skid plate, it won't. But if you have the standard OEM skid plate, you should be fine. But we had to go to the hardware store and we had to get some longer M10 bolts for the front to here. And then we also ended up stacking these spacers. The bottom spacers are already on the TRD skid plate, but we ended up putting a second spacer on top with some longer bolts, and then in the rear we put some 3/4 inch spacers on there, and the factory bolts do work. All right, we have the 4Runner back on the ground. The diff drop is fully installed, leveling kit is fully installed, and now the 4Runner looks a lot better. Front is level with the rear. We have the diff drop in, so now the axles are at a more standard spec and we don't have to worry about axle binding or CV boots ripping in the future. Hopefully this video helps you. If you have any questions regarding a leveling kit or diff drop for your 4Runner, if you want this particular setup, you can head over to yodaexpedition.com and grab one.